Hello, this is Professor Glenn Lewis, Director of Journalism at York College-CUNY. I'm thrilled to be here with Jewel B. on So Bookin' Cool to talk about my new book, Sparring with Smokin Joe. I hope you read it and enjoy it, and certainly listen to our conversation.
So Bookin', so Bookin', so Bookin' Cool.
That's so motherfucking cool. So listen to So Bookin' Cool.
Welcome to So Bookin' Cool. It's Jewel B. Today's guest is a veteran author and journalist. He created the multi-award-winning journalism program at York College in 1986. Before becoming the director of the major, he was an adjunct professor who covered numerous stories. He is also a professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. His new book is called Sparring with Smokin Joe, Joe Frazier's Epic Battles and Rivalry with Ali. Here with us today, he is Glenn Lewis. Stay tuned for our conversation, only on So Bookin' Cool.
Hi, how are you? So glad to be here.
So glad to have you. So glad to have you. Do you want me to call you Mr. Lewis, Mr. Glenn?
How about just Glenn?
Okay, that works. So, how have you been doing, first off, managing through the pandemic and everything that has been going on?
It's been tough. It's been interesting. In the beginning, I was still finishing the book, and my wife and I have been quarantining, from the beginning. So it was hard because I had to first adjust to teaching online for the first time, and we only had a week to transition. And at that same time, I was doing the finishing touches on the book, and then after that, the post-production work. So I'd been constantly teaching online for the first time, which is very labor intensive, and finishing up the book and then working on the editing and post-production work, which is also pretty labor intensive. So it was a matter of sort of quarantining while working around the clock. Not a good combination.
Yeah, wow. And through all of that going on, did you make any self-discoveries?
Yeah, quite a few. Number one, I think I realized more than ever what kind of a social creature I am, and that I really crave interaction with other people. I missed having firsthand conversations rather than over the phone or through Zoom. I missed the casual things that we take for granted, being able to stop off and talk to a neighbor, or stop and speak to someone on the street, or of course the interactions with my students, face-to-face at the college, and doing face-to-face interviews rather than over Zoom or a podcast.
Yeah. Speaking of it, by the way, we always hear people say, oh, journalism is dying in terms of print and stuff. Are those comments true, or is it just a matter of journalism changing and evolving?
I think you hit the exact right word. Journalism is evolving. Now, granted, it's evolving by necessity, but I think what's happening is you're getting so many more outlets for people to engage with the public. Just what you're doing now is a perfect example. Rather than having everything centralized in news organizations that have been around for a long time and have all sort of the same traditional values, I think what we're getting is a much broader cross-section of news organizations and more privately run news situations that are engaging, the public in so many different ways and from so many different perspectives. So I think, if anything, journalism is just growing exponentially.
As someone who's been doing this since not to out your age, even though it's a blessing to get older and stuff, but somebody who has so much experience and years under their belt, how did you get started, and when did you know that this was the career that you wanted?
Good questions. I actually started in creative writing. I took creative writing in college, more than journalism, and got encouraged there. I did well, got some things bought and published, and then went for a master's degree in creative writing at City College here in New York, and got a chance to be the protege of Joseph Heller, a very famous writer, wrote the most read book in history except for the Bible. So that's pretty incredible. And he was the one, and some of the other teachers that I had there, Kurt Vonnegut, some of these other people, encouraged me to do journalism to improve my creative writing. They said the journalism will make the creative writing ring more true. You always want to have a certain amount of truth in any fiction you're writing because it makes that fiction more believable. And I've always taught my journalism students to do the opposite, to study creative writing, to make their scenes more graphic and to make their descriptions and character developments, more creative. So both sort of work well with the other. So I started in creative writing, but that pushed me into journalism. And I, after a while, loved journalism maybe as much or more than I did creative writing.
And what about sports?
All right. Well, sports have always been part of my life. When I was very young, I used to sit and watch sports with my father. That was one of the ways we sort of connected with each other, by watching sports on TV. And it's funny, I mean, some of the stories that are in the book about certain fights that had a huge impact on me and my impressions about boxing in general happened when I was young and watching these live fights, on Friday nights with my father. In one of them, for instance, a very famous fight, a boxer was killed in the ring. And that's something that stayed with me for a long, long time. And you were watching somebody being killed in the ring live on TV. And that story actually is retold in the book.
So did you play sport besides covering it?
No, I played sports in high school. I was adamant and loved basketball, and I swam and did track and a little bit of cross country. But I've always played sports, and I've always, not always, but since 1977, have been covering sports. Sports is sort of a reflection of our society. It's a reflection of our lives. It's a place where all your desires to succeed, all that you've done to prepare yourself for different things in your life, your character, your judgment, all gets compressed into short periods of time, whether it's, a few seconds for a race or a few minutes, for a certain kind of volley or whatever it happens to be, or a couple of hours for a game. But it's like all the different elements that make up people's desire to succeed and desires for excellence and that show people's characters. It all gets compressed into that time period. And it's a dramatic thing to watch and interpret if you look at it the right way.
So sports is not just it's not just business and it's not just entertainment.
No, I don't think so. I think sports shows us, if we look at it correctly, reflections of life and people's character and people's, best and worst qualities.
Wow, yeah, that's a great way to look at it. How did becoming an author come into the picture for you? Did it seem natural, being that your love for writing and your career in writing?
It was like an evolution, I think. I published my first book in 1981 with a major house, with Holton Company. It was a very strange book for me to do. It was a health and beauty and fitness and advice book that I did with a model from the Ford modeling agency.
Mhm.
And it actually sold very well. It sold well here in the States, and it was on a bestseller list in England and got translated into a couple of other languages, around the world, and did pretty well. And it was, it was an experience for me because it wasn't an area I necessarily knew, but my attitude as a journalist is you can become an instant expert on almost anything. You just have to do your homework and brush up. And so what I did is I learned about that audience and what they cared about and helped this model reach that audience.
I mean, I'm excited to talk more about your new book, of course, but with journalism and speaking of like classes and teaching and everything, what is it like to teach and direct a program for a field that you've worked in for many years?
It's great. You get a chance, I think, number one, to look at the things you've done right and wrong and decide how you can turn them into meaningful lessons. So it's, when you've done something as a profession and now you're teaching it, if you're smart, you'll look first at your mistakes to see where you could teach other people to not go wrong where you went wrong early on. And then the other thing is to look at what you do well or what you've studied and see where that you can do better, and to try and teach people the way you would like to have been taught yourself, to be able to internalize it and make it part of what they're doing in that field.
What are some mistakes and what are some things that you think journalism students excel in?
Well, not that you can excel in mistakes, but I see what you mean.
Right. Yeah.
What they do well or what they do wrong.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Doing this book gave me a chance to sort of incorporate some of those lessons that I do about making mistakes early on. You got to remember, I reported this book originally in 1980. So I was much, much younger. It's 40 years ago. And it was very early in my career. And I was still learning to do things on sort of the next level and do things right. And you could see when I was writing the book, the first couple of chapters, maybe it's a little more obvious, but there's certain parts of the book where, looking back at how I handled interviews 40 years ago, how I set up my relationship with Joe early on, and some of the things I did to pressure him to talk about things that I wanted him to talk about, seemed a little heavy-handed looking back from where I am now. And I realized that in certain instances, what I thought was the right thing to do was the absolute wrong thing to do. So I found myself, while I was recounting some of these stories in the book, sort of pointing out to the reader at the same time that for a journalist, this is a really bad mistake to make. Yeah. And I think, from what I've heard so far from people who've done reviews on the book and who've read early versions that came out, they really enjoyed those aspects of the book.
Yeah, I've always thought that you were a strong writer. And it's like, of course, because you were my professor, so you were teaching it. So of course you have that experience and that knowledge. Yeah, when did the idea for Sparring with Smokin Joe exactly come to you?
Well, like I said, I did the reporting for this 40 years ago. So originally, I had done an interview with Joe Frazier and his son, Marvis, for another publication, for one publication called Family Weekly, which was actually a really great place to write and a big publication. I don't think it exists anymore, but it used to be one of the largest circulation magazines in the world. It was a Sunday news magazine like Parade that used to appear in over 360 newspapers around the country every Sunday. And so I was writing for them, which gave me exposure, gave me a chance to have articles that I wrote that were being read by like 40 million people, which is pretty incredible. And so anyhow, I had done an article originally for them on Joe Frazier, a shorter interview. And then I heard rumors that Muhammad Ali was coming out of retirement to fight for the heavyweight championship, and Joe was in retirement, and there was rumors that Joe would follow Ali out of retirement, which could plausibly have produced a fourth fight between them, which at the time would have been the biggest fight in history, maybe one of the biggest sporting events in all of history. Something that the whole country, the whole world would have, anticipated. So my agent at the time got me included on a deal to do an article on that for Esquire. And so that's why I was there originally, to do the reporting for several months, was to do this Esquire article. And then years later, I wanted to do a book or a movie out of this. I had one, movie offer that I sort of put off because I didn't want to clash with things that Joe and his family were writing at the time. And I just sort of bided my time until I felt I could write about this in a way that was comfortable for me and didn't threaten or challenge what other people in Joe's family wanted to write.
Where does it stand now with the movie? Are you still open to it?
Yeah, actually, there is somebody in Hollywood who's looking at this book for a potential movie, but it's very early on, and there's no idea whether that will work out or not. Those things are always very iffy, and can fall apart 100 different ways. So, and right now it's very, very early. So, but if something came from it, it would be great. If not, I'm sure the book will do fine on its own.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. And what was it like to cover somebody who's just so popular and well known and such a force like Frazier, seeing the ups and the downs and being right there to see all of that?
Well, actually, that was really one of the things I think that make this book different from most sports kind of books. Rather than just focus only on his major fights and the major parts of his career, I spent several months in the gym, traveling down south with him, close to where he grew up in South Carolina. We were in Augusta, Georgia, meeting with people in his family, getting to see him among old friends, and also with Black society down there and white society, which in 1980 was still, a little bit rigid, those dividing lines still, in the South. Mm-hmm. And watching how people of all backgrounds, related to him and felt as if they knew him because they had watched him in the public eye for so long. And on the other hand, one of the other things that became really apparent is the strain it sort of takes on somebody even like Joe, who's used to this and done this over the years, to constantly being engaged and sort of constantly being aware that you're being observed no matter where you are and what you're doing. And Joe made himself particularly approachable, which sort of made that even more difficult because everybody felt entitled to just sort of walk up to him and join his life.
Where do you think that tension came from, though, between Ali and Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because they started as very good friends. One of the things I make clear in the book, and it's clear in a lot of the stuff that's been written about them, is that early on in their careers, they were very supportive of each other. They were very friendly. They worked out together. Ali sort of always complimented Joe early on and vice versa in building them up. I think what happened was after Ali was banished from boxing in 1967 because of refusing the Vietnam era draft and because of his court conviction because of that. Joe initially was the first one in boxing to come out and defend Ali. He even offered him money to carry him through while he was out of boxing. So that was, they were still very good friends. After 3.5 years, when Ali came back and they were going to be fighting for the heavyweight championship in what is known as the fight of the century, which was on March 8th, 1971, that's when problems started to develop, because in the promotion for the fight, Ali decided that the fight would sell better if people saw him as the person who represented the counterculture group in that era, people who were against the draft, saw him as the black man's champion. And of course, if he was going to do that, he had to try to paint Joe as the white man's champion, as the person who defended the establishment, defended the war. And what he was doing was projecting things on Joe that weren't totally true. And he did it in a way that became really brutal. He used very graphic, sometimes racially charged language that you would never expect to come out of Muhammad Ali's mouth, in denigrating Joe and in sort of calling him more or less an inferior black man. And Joe took it very personally. He never understood and never really felt comfortable or believed that this was necessary to promote the fights. And Ali kept this going throughout their rivalry. And ultimately, what I saw when I was covering Joe is that that rhetoric that Ali used that he thought was showmanship actually served to somewhat alienate Joe from the black community. And I think he felt that throughout, the latter part of his life.
Wow. So the 50th anniversary of the fight between Ali and Frazier is coming up on March 8th.
Right,
And
the 50th anniversary, right.
yes, so what does that event mean to you? What is the significance of it racially and culturally?
Okay, that's a great question. Again, Ali and Frazier and their rivalry became sort of a touchstone for that era, for the whole 60s and 70s era. And again, people who are too young to remember will see this as history. People who are a little bit older and could remember the environment around that fight will relive this almost like current events. But what people have to understand was how politically charged this whole thing was and culturally charged. Literally, this whole country and maybe throughout the world, people were literally taking sides. You were either for Ali or for Frazier. You were either an Ali person or you were a Frazier person. And it got to the point where it almost mimics the way in today's society, you're either a Democrat or you're a Republican. You're either for Trump or you're against Trump. I mean, we're seeing sort of echoes of that today, and it became that politically and culturally charged back then. And the thing that's interesting is the popularity of their rivalry has only grown over the years. In recent years, Ali's been dead for 5 years now. Joe died in, the 10th anniversary of his death is going to be coming up next year. Just recently, several major news organizations took a vote on what was the most important individual sports rivalry, not a team, in any sport, the individual sports rivalry in the history of sports. And most of them chose Ali and Frazier. So the popularity and the recognition of that rivalry has just grown. And what it meant is now being sort of retaught as history rather than current events.
What can boxers learn from Joe and Ali and their journey, and definitely Sparring with Smokin Joe?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that made Ali great was obviously his grace for somebody so big, his speed, his footwork, his balance, his thinking attitude in the ring. He was always thinking through different strategies and different approaches to sort of game each fight and make sure that he was getting every possible edge he could. Joe was incredibly disciplined. He trained incessantly. He always wanted to out-train anyone he fought. He always wanted to be in the best possible condition. He didn't move as gracefully as Ali, and he didn't have the footwork, but what he did have was very deceptive bobbing and weaving techniques to work his way into bigger fighters, because Joe was only 5'11" compared to most of the taller fighters then. I mean, Ali was more like 6'4", 6'3", or 6'4". So he was normally fighting people much larger, and his ability to work his way in and get the most power from his punches, and his ability to sort of press the fight all the way through. These are things that you can learn by watching them, but you also have to have the sort of intestinal fortitude to want to do these things as well. You know, so that each fighter, I guess, would have to bring and find within themselves.
Oh, I love that. Find within themselves. Yes, absolutely. So what have been some of the most memorable moments that you have had so far when writing Sparring with Smokin Joe?
Well, I have to go back.
Even though it's been a long time. Yeah, it's been a long time in the making.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the events in the book are pretty startling and pretty wonderful. I mean, in a way, I got a chance to experience some great things. The book is written very episodically. It's written where in each chapter there's several sort of vignettes and stories that hold up on their own, that get woven together to make the chapter and move the book forward. So some of these stories, you know, were sort of special. In one instance, we were down in Augusta, Georgia, and we were finishing up. Joe had his band. He was a singer then. He had his own band, and he was building his music career. And we were playing in a predominantly Black club in a sort of rough area in Augusta, Georgia. We were finishing up on a very rainy night, about 1 or 2 in the morning. And as we were getting to leave, James Brown, the singer, walked in the door. And he was an old friend of Joe's who grew up nearby in the South. And he had come to see Joe. And they were talking and had agreed to meet in about an hour or so back at Joe's hotel room to chat and sort of catch up. And they invited me to join them. And so I got a chance to spend a couple of hours sitting with Joe and James Brown talking about music and boxing. Turns out that James Brown had been an amateur boxer earlier on in his career.
Really?
Yeah. And at some point, you know, Joe and him got up and they were sort of shadow boxing with each other and playing around and laughing. And then at one point, Joe wanted to learn more about the music business, and he was pushing James Brown to teach him more about recording sessions and all that. And a bunch of people piled into Joe's car, drove out to the woods where James Brown had this rustic studio. And we spent a couple of hours there where James Brown was teaching Joe how to produce records, and they were talking fighting and talking about their families, and it's all in the book. You'll see. But that was sort of a wonderful moment. And then the next morning, Joe did an impromptu interview for James Brown's radio station in Augusta.
Wow, that is all amazing. Mr. Lewis, I know I can't help it. I can't help it, Glenn.
That's okay.
What is your advice for people who are interviewing high profile people? But obviously you've interviewed a number of them. you know, in addition to Joe Frazier and being around James Brown as well. When Caitlyn Jenner was Bruce Jenner, Bill
Yeah,
Bradley, Reggie Jackson, Walter Payton, it goes on and on. So what is your advice for interviewing high profile people? And is it any different from doing regular interviews?
yeah, it can be. One of the things that I was taught early on by more veteran journalists was don't be a fan. Don't ever be a fan when you're being a professional. So when you're doing an interview and you really want to try to be on an equal footing with anyone you're interviewing, even if it's someone you greatly admire, even if it's someone you always dreamed of meeting. Early on in my career, I got to do an interview with Walter Cronkite, who, for me, growing up, was the most famous journalist in the world and the most influential journalist in the world. And here I was, you know, doing an interview with him at CBS. And if you're not on an equal footing, you're not going to get a good interview. You can't be a fan and be a journalist at the same time. And sometimes that takes discipline. You have to get into the right mindset. You have to make sure that your questions have the right tone to it. You have to make sure that you move the things along briskly in a way where you don't allow yourself to get caught up in wanting to tell this person stories that they might not want to hear, or to try and establish a friendship that's not necessary to get a good story. So that's an important thing to remember, that you're there to work, not to make friends.
Yes, I always remember too. I remember a lot from taking journalism. One of the things I remember that you emphasized conflict of interest, and journalists should be wary of conflicts of interest.
Yeah, that's another thing as well. Obviously, you're there to serve the needs of your audience, and you're there to serve the needs of your news organization when you're going to do the interview. And your own personal preferences and needs should take a backseat to that.
Did you get a lot of high profile interviews by not being a fan?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I wound up originally getting a lot of these high profile interviews by making sure that I was writing for publications or working for news outlets that would get a certain amount of respect from people, you know, of a certain status. So, but that's something you do by building up. You know, everybody has to start sort of working for, you know, more modest or more local news organizations or news publications. And then you try to build up who you're working for, so that when you go to these people to suggest an interview, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing that news organization, and their respect for the news organization will help get you in the door, so to speak. And then after that, if you're professional, they'll remember you as a professional, and the next time it becomes easier.
How have you grown since co-authoring the Big Beauty book
Oh,
as
God.
an author?
I think, you know, well, first of all, you know, you and I have always talked about what it takes to master being a writer. And I think that's something you never totally do, nor you should never think that you've got your writing totally mastered. One of the things that makes any form of writing or any form of media so exciting is that there's always room for improvement. There's always new techniques you could learn, you know, sort of more colors to add to your palette, more choices of things that you can have at your disposal in order to tell that story in a way that's going to make it compelling for your audience. So that's one thing. I always want to feel that I'm growing as a journalist, as a writer, as an interviewer, as somebody who can read people well. You want to always feel that you can do it better than you did it before. And you always want to try to be aware of picking up on things in interviews and picking up on things in other people's writings that could be instructive to you. You know, I look not only for my mistakes, I look for other people's mistakes, and I try to learn from mistakes first, and then think about what I can learn to give me more choices to avoid those mistakes.
Mm. And what motivates you?
What motivates me is telling a good story. What motivates me is bringing other people's lives and situations to life for my audience. I want to humanize everything I write. I don't want people to just see themes or easy answers or just sayings or just slogans or just, simple points of view. I want them to see that anything of meaning has somebody's life attached to it, or many people's lives and fortunes attached to it. And I want them to see the humanity in all these stories.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful, Glenn.
Thank you.
You no problem. You did touch on this earlier, but what can sports fans and non-sport fans alike, appreciate from Sparring with Smokin Joe?
Well, there's a lot of sports fans out there that are very knowledgeable, and they know the facts of Ali and Frazier's fights and background and rivalry really well. But some of them only know the public persona that they got a chance to see from both Joe and Ali. And I think in particular, this book gives people a chance to get to know Joe sort of along with me, the way I got to know him over a period of time, and to see him in all these different situations, dealing with the public, dealing with his son, dealing with members of his family, dealing with, again, the white and black, communities, people of all different socioeconomic classes. And so it gives you a chance to see him in a much more human light, and gives you a chance to appreciate the stresses and the things that he had to deal with in order to excel.
And on that note, Professor Glenn Lewis, author Glenn Lewis, I could really keep the conversation going. We definitely have to do this again where we talk specifically about journalism writing as well, because you are a pro, and anybody who reads Sparring with Smokin Joe, Joe Frazier's epic battles and rivalry with Ali, they'll see this, guys, this is coming from a pro, somebody who's been there, and it's just going to be amazing. And the book comes out February the 10th, right? February the 10th, 2021.
February 10th.
Okay, that's wonderful. How can people keep up with you and connect with you and stuff like that? Are you looking forward to getting like reader mail and stuff like that?
Oh, love to. Right now, I mean, the best ways to do it is probably through LinkedIn and Facebook. I've been trying to do more social media, a little bit of Twittering, but more Facebook, I guess, and LinkedIn. And I want people to engage with me. I want people to tell me what they think of the book, tell me what they like, tell me what they wish had been different. I want to know what impacted them, and what they thought of different aspects of the book. I love engaging with readers. To me, that's one of the reasons to write. You want to know that some people are reacting and you're impacting people in some way, and then talking about that and sharing it with them makes the whole thing worthwhile.
Yeah, and it's not boring. Like you know how to pull people in. You know how to pull people in, which isn't always
never boring. And I find that everybody seems to have something valuable to tell me.
So the bonus question is, what is your advice for authors out there, and specifically nonfiction authors?
Well, first of all, I think you have to read. Whether you're going to write fiction, whether you're going to do journalism, whatever you want to do, read what interests you, read what you want to write about, become conversant in the area that you want to be an expert on or that you want to write about, and see what other people have to say, see how other people said what they have to say, and see what is new and what has been recurring in this area. and get a sense of where your niche can be to add to the conversation. What can you bring that someone else is not bringing, and where can you fit into the conversation about this subject that allows you to do something original and something, inspiring for other people.
That's right, Mr. Glenn Lewis. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Inspiring words. All right. It's been wonderful. And, I wish you best of luck with the book and everything. It's much needed. I'm glad that you wrote it. Yeah, no problem. No problem at all. And yeah, thank you to all the listeners. Until next time, so booking cool.